remind, excuse me, remind everyone that this is being recorded and it will be posted publicly. So mind your manners. No. And I'll turn it over to Michael Kramer for the introduction of our guest this evening.
Hi, Al. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today at the SUNY Historians Network webinar series. This is the final of our spring 2024 pilot series brought to you by the SUNY History Lab, which is based at SUNY Brockport and directed by me and a few other faculty members at Brockport, and we'll continue, I'm glad to say, next year with our webinar series in U.S. history and expanding to a few other subfields. My name is Michael Kramer again, and I'm in the Department of History at SUNY Brockport. And the History Lab and the webinar network are part of our efforts to try to bring together campuses across our very decentralized system more robustly around historical inquiry, creating more exchange and scholarly community in the study of history across SUNY and in the state of New York. And today we have a wonderful presentation, and I'll be introducing Dr. Kori A. Graves in a moment, who'll be speaking about her research into what she calls the abortion menace, African Americans and abortion, 1950 to 1972. Before I introduce Dr. Graves, I just want to let everyone know, if you haven't joined us before, how these webinars work. You've probably been to many, having lived through the pandemic. We generally have the presentation, and then we use the Q&A function, which I believe is set up today, although I need to check with Lynn Ann.
It is. It's okay, ready wonderful. To go. And wonderful. It should be visible right on the bottom ticker tape of your screen.
Okay. Perfect. So generally, we invite you to place questions into the Q&A. And then I can either read them out after Dr. Graves' talk, or if you wish to ask a question or have a comment yourself, you can unmute after the talk and ask your question. So we welcome exchange, dialogue, conversation, and we're glad to have, I think, a very hearty crew here, given that it's June, just after the end of the semester. So we really appreciate all of you joining us at this time. Okay, now that our administrative work is done, one other comment administratively. If you're interested in joining our mailing list, in the chat, I have put a link to my email address, and you can email me if you'd like to receive our web newsletter and event announcements and so on. You'll also see the link for the webinar page, which is maintained by Lynn Ann McCoy-Hines, who helps us at the Center for Professional Development in SUNY to bring these webinars to life and to you. So those are some useful links for you if you're interested in continuing to participate. Okay, I think I've got all the administrative matters now set. So let me introduce Dr. Kori A. Graves, who we're thrilled to have present to us today. Dr. Graves is an associate professor of history at the University at Albany in the SUNY system, and Dr. Graves' research interests allow her to pursue questions that evaluate the significance of political and popular representations of gender, race, nation, and family. Her book, A War-Born Family, African American Adoption in the Wake of the Korean War, tells the story of the first African Americans who adopted Korean children and the ways their efforts revealed the contested nature of adoptive family formation across national boundaries and color lines. She teaches courses about gender and women's history, the history of marriage and family, and histories of the body, beauty, and identity politics in the US. A dedicated educator, Dr. Graves has also won awards for teaching excellence. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Graves, and I'll hand it over to you now for your talk.
Thank you so much, Michael. It is really an honor to participate in this inaugural History Network series. And today, what I'll be talking about is the so-called abortion menace. And you'll see when I share, actually get to the full slide presentation, you'll see where that title comes from. And as I'm presenting, if something happens with audio, just shout out to me because I, I will be reading and I won't be paying as much attention to the screen. And also, I'm going to set a timer. I am notoriously long-winded, so this will help me rein it in. I do prepare comments, but I sometimes go off script. So I'm going to make sure that I'm paying attention to time today also. And before I begin, I just have to say hello to Christina Boylan. Christina and I went to college together, so, and I won't even tell you how long ago, and we reconnected just recently. So I'm thrilled to see you, Christina, and we'll catch up later.
Yep,
But
me too, Kori.
we haven't talked since college, which is really, it's like, this is such a wonderful blast. So I'm thrilled for many reasons to participate in today's discussion. So let me go ahead and show the screen. And again, if at any point there's weirdness on the screen or you can't hear me, just shout out because I will be reading and I won't have my eyes on the screen. All right. As you can see, today I'm thinking about the abortion menace, African Americans, and abortion 1950 to 1972. And as I said, this title comes from an article that I encountered in Ebony magazine. Other scholars have written about this article, but I have a couple of things that I'm going to add to some of that discussion. On June 24, 1922, excuse me, not 2022, when news broke of the Supreme Court's ruling in the case Dodds versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, my family was making its way to Salt Lake City. That wasn't our final destination. We were actually in the middle of a 3,323-mile trek in the U.S. West. The next day, we decided to go up to the Capitol to see if there were protests or celebrations. And what we found were 11 pro-choice supporters, hardy young people, holding signs and chanting slogans about women's bodies and women's rights. Their voices were almost imperceptible as we walked around the vast grounds, and you can sort of see from a bit of this image that it is quite expansive around the state capitol in Salt Lake City, Utah. So we couldn't really hear them, and you can barely see them if you really squint and look at the post. It's probably sort of central, but to the left, you'll see a few of those signs, but there were literally about 11 people. And it was only when we were climbing the stairs near their small protest zone that we could actually hear them. In true family vacation form, the 1997 VW camper van we were driving broke down in Utah, and we ended up staying there a few days longer than we had planned. So we made it to the Great Salt Lake. I took a quick picture, and then the van stopped. So we were able to chug down to a big parking lot, get an Uber, and we ended up in Ogden, which is just a little bit north. Now, my husband likes doing like city adventures. So he opted to do the runs from, let's see, he had to take they have a light rail. So he had to take the light rail from Ogden to Salt Lake City to this neat little shop that only does VW vans. So he opted to do that. And he said that while he was interacting with the tow truck driver and the mechanics to get the van repaired, he was shocked to hear them describe concern about protesters in Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, you would get the impression, based on what my husband was hearing, that these gentlemen were, and it was all men, were really concerned that a mob was going to descend on their capital and really make a spectacle. And you can imagine that we were shocked by their fears and perceptions of what was taking place because of what we had seen at the Capitol in the days before. In other cities around the US, there were protests, but I found myself paying more attention to the few oft-repeated slogans of pro-life activists, sayings like adoption, not abortion, and less adoption, more abortion. Because of my interest in the histories of adoption and specifically adoptions involving African Americans, these slogans were particularly troubling. An email I received a short time after the Dodds decision confirmed that others familiar with these histories were also bothered. Consequently, I joined a group, and the organization is called the Alliance for the Study of Adoption Culture. I've been a member for years and years, and it's quite a sort of interdisciplinary organization, but it also incorporates adoptees, and many of the scholars involved are adoptees, adult adoptees, also first mothers, the birth mothers, adoptive parents. So it really draws on people from a wide range of personal and professional experiences and interests in adoption. So I joined these individuals, activists, adoptees, first mothers, and scholars, and we produced a special volume of the journal Adoption and Culture to respond to the Dodds decision and the deceptive idea that adoption is a remedy for abortion. The piece I contributed, titled The Debt We Owe, grew out of questions that I had actually been thinking about for years, even before Dodds came up. The issues that affected African Americans regarding not just abortion, but yes, that question of where adoption fits in as a solution to a number of problems that people observed in community. Now, I did that in part because of the woman that you see on the screen now. This is Dr. Dorothea Brown, and the image in the center has actually been over my many desks as I wrote my dissertation and later finished the book, because it was an image that I just couldn't get out of my mind. This is Dr. Brown on the left and her adopted daughter, Lola, carrying the doctor's bag, and there they are at the top of the screen. So I first learned about Dr. Brown when I read about her unprecedented legal adoption of a child as a single mother in Tennessee in 1958. This was in Ebony magazine. The magazine's celebration of the so-called bachelor mother, and you can see the title there, and many of the other stories that I encountered as I conducted research in African American newspapers and magazines that were published in the 1950s and 60s and 70s told me a lot about the difficulties African Americans faced when they wanted to either adopt a child or, for in the case of mothers, birth mothers, first mothers, when they wanted to relinquish a child for adoption. And I'm going to give this is going to be very general, but in general, adoption agencies defined standards they used to screen potential adoptive families in those decades. And they included things like adoptive parents had to be married, individual singles people were not approved for most adoptions through these established agencies. They also had to be medically sterile, and a doctor had to certify that medical condition. Couples had to be economically stable, and this meant that they needed to show proof of a savings account, insurance, life insurance, and they needed to have a residence, whether an apartment or a house. They included a separate room for the adopted child. My research then in the records of these agencies and national organizations, child welfare organizations, confirmed that these standards were quite limiting. They varied from agency to agency and state to state, but most child welfare officials and social workers used some combination, either all or some combination of the above and more, to assess and evaluate adoptive families. Because of legacies of racial inequality and segregation, African Americans were quite limited. They were barred in many cases or limited from participating in economic, educational, and social opportunities that would allow them to obtain that kind of profile. Hence, this is why Dr. Brown was remarkable and her adoption was celebrated. But Dr. Brown was remarkable for a number of reasons. And as I was exploring her story of adoption, I discovered that she has a tie to the history of abortion. And so I got interested in looking at this connection, and it's what inspired my desire to put together an article to help bring her back into this historical conversation. So, first, what I want to do is tell you a little bit about her connection with adoption, not just her adoption of a child, but how she's sort of connected as a child who was fostered for many years. And then I'll transition into what I see taking place in her advocacy for abortion, and then come back and sort of tie it back into this question of adoption versus abortion, or as the remedy. So Dr. Brown, as you can see, she is an adoptive mother. And in this Ebony piece, when she explained some of the reason why adoption appealed to her, she said, "I love children and I wanted to help one as I had been helped." Here was a little kind of indication and a hint of part of her story, her personal story. She would tell in this Ebony piece and in many pieces, there's so many articles where she tells a version of the story. She would describe that she was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but when she was months old, her mother moved to the Hudson Valley and then relinquished her child to the Troy Orphan Asylum in Troy, New York. She would spend the next 12 years there as a warden. She described being quite happy. It was very strict, and there were things about it that were challenging. For one, she remembered being one of maybe 6 or 7 African American children in the asylum that had around 350 children. And she remembered issues of racial discrimination that did come up. In fact, one story she tells is they used to go over to Emma Willard, and they would take the girls over to visit with the girls of the asylum, would go visit with the girls who were studying at Emma Willard. But because Emma Willard wouldn't allow the African American children to come, they were kept outside the gates. And so she described that there were issues. But one thing she also remembered was this moment where she had to have a tonsillectomy, and her experience with the doctors and her curiosity about that set up for her a desire to become a physician herself. Her birth mother, though, returned when she was about 13 and pulled young Dorothy out of the orphanage because she was old enough to go to work, and her mother needed her labor to supplement her household income. And so she did. At 13, she worked as a maid and as a mother's aide. And one of the families that she worked with, one of the mothers who worked with her, asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. And I'm kind of uncharitable. I should be more charitable, but I'm kind of uncharitable. And I have a voice in my head. And I think of this woman sort of asking, "Dorothy, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And Dorothy said, "A doctor." And to this mother's credit, she took her seriously. And she said, "Well, then we need to get you back in school." So they made efforts to get her back into the school system at Troy. She did enroll at Troy High School. It seems like for a while she went back and forth with her mom. There were cases where she ran away, but ultimately she ended up homeless. And once the principal of her high school figured this out, he used his connections in the community and found a family. This family became her forever family. They didn't legally adopt her. They were African American foster parents, and the household was meager, but it sounds like it was quite loving. The family fostered something up to 14 children, and Dr. Brown was just one of many who had come through this home. This forever family was so influential in Doc Brown's life that she named her adoptive daughter, Lola, after her foster mother, Lola. Once she finished high school, so that's in her future, of course, but once she finished high school and she excelled, it was time to make decisions about college. And I will tell you this. So she's in the Hudson Valley area, and we are right across the river from Troy, where we live now. When I started reading about her, I felt like I had to tell her story because she and I have traversed some similar geography. So her next journey was to Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, and that's where I grew up. She ended up at Bennett because she had an encounter with another woman who was a Methodist, and she says that the woman came up to her and said, "Dorothy, what's your religion?" And Dorothy said, "I think I'm Christian." And she said this woman responded, "Well, you need to be Methodist because the Methodist women have a scholarship for a young woman to go to Bennett." She went to Bennett. She graduated second in her class in 1941. And then she pursued her medical education at Meharry in Nashville, Tennessee, one of a handful of medical colleges in Tennessee, which I find fascinating. She completed her MD in 1948 and then wanted to do a residency in surgery. She wanted to do it at Harlem Hospital, but they wouldn't admit her. Part of this was about her gender, being a woman, and not exclusively about race. Most physicians at the time didn't believe a woman could stand up to the rigors of a surgery residency. So she went back to Meharry. She convinced her professors there and the physicians to let her be a resident in their surgical unit. And she was successful. In fact, when she graduated or finished the residency, she excelled, and by 1957, she had emerged as their chief of surgery, a position she would hold until 1983. She was the chief of surgery at Riverside Hospital. She also, though, had a private practice, and she describes this as a kind of economic necessity. The surgery piece was not as predictable or consistent, so she had a private practice where she worked as an internist, and so she treated patients with a range of medical needs. And it was in this private practice setting that she encountered the young woman who asked her to adopt Lola. Brown so this is what I see as a kind of connection to this adoption piece that goes much deeper than just having a desire to parent. She says, and this is why I used it in the article for the Dodds issue, she felt like it was the debt she owed, but not a burdensome debt. She needed to pay this forward in the life of another child. And she did it in a way that was exceptional. She said she didn't think she was ever going to marry, and she never did, but she wanted to be a mom. Now, another way that she was remarkable was that she became the first African American woman to win a seat in Tennessee's state house. She was one of the representatives, and she did that in 1966. At the time, she was a well established, respected, and liked figure in the community. She was able to do this because she was independent and she had her own money, so she kind of beat back the political bosses in Nashville, Tennessee. And she was responsible for a number of pieces of legislation that people still point to as quite something to be celebrated. One of the big ones is that she sponsored a bill establishing, at the time it was a Black History Week, which later would extend into Black History Month. And she was sort of at the forefront of those efforts to get Black History Months established, not just in Tennessee, but across the country. But she also sponsored a bill that would have expanded women's access to abortion in cases of rape, incest, or, and this language is not language we use today, but if the baby was deformed. And that's a direct quote from the literature. Dr. Brown's support of this issue became a focus of my research, in part because when I was going through her papers, I had a chance to go to her papers are housed at the Franklin Library at Fisk University. And I had a chance to go through all of her papers. And I found newspaper clippings. She was quite, at the time, she was, people really sought her out. So newspaper clippings, interviews she had given, and an interview, a student interviewed her. So I had this oral interview, I got to hear her voice. So I was paying attention to her, but it was this next piece that really drew me to this story because what I found surprising in these records were the many speeches. She was a devout Methodist, and so every Sunday, every Wednesday, every opportunity she had, she's in church giving speeches about her faith. Dr. Brown described herself as a devout Methodist, and it's really clear that faith was important to her. So I found myself thinking about these two pieces of her life, this woman of faith, of deep religious conviction, and also a woman who's advocating for something today that seems or is often placed in opposition. In fact, so much of the contemporary discussion around the pro-choice, pro-life debate offer up these ideas that religious conservatives, individuals and organizations are and have been the driving force behind much of the pro-life activism. In fact, as historian Leslie Reagan notes in her book, When Abortion Was a Crime, the anti-abortion discourse that developed in the 1960s and 70s has overshadowed interdenominational religious opinion that supports legal abortion. Dr. Brown's embrace of both choice and faith provide an example of ways that religious belief and abortion activism coexisted. In fact, when I think about the way that Dr. Brown was a part of three key communities attempting to expand legal abortion, and here I'm thinking about her role as a physician, as a state legislator, and as a devout Methodist, those things show how ideas about choice and faith remained relevant even as the dominant narrative suggesting that faith and choice are in opposition became entrenched. Indeed, as Reagan demonstrates, the leading medical association in the US at the time, the American Medical Association, and many Protestant denominations were moving away from opposition to all abortions by the time Dr. Brown introduced her bill in Tennessee. The bill would have reversed the state's 1883 bill that limited women's access to therapeutic abortion to only cases where a mother's life was in jeopardy. And here I include just a list of throughout the 19th century, almost every state, and in fact, every state passed a law prohibiting abortion in some way. And this is after a history where the choices that women and providers had were quite left to them. So she would have been working to reverse that 19th century law. Dr. Brown was actually one of many physicians who joined with the Tennessee Medical Association to testify during a Tennessee State House public hearing. The hearing was to discuss the possibility of overturning that 1883 law. It took place in 1968 because of the bill that she had sponsored. She had initially introduced it in 67 and then pulled back and realized she wanted to do more research. So in 68, she reintroduces this bill. Now, the newspaper coverage of this hearing highlight the divisions among physicians. And it shows that there was division over even keeping the therapeutic option available. And it still meant that women had to go before a board of physicians for approval, even if the life of the mother was in jeopardy. There was also disagreement over the very circumstances that should merit this expanded access to abortion. But Dr. Brown was unwavering in her insistence that women and girls should have the right to abortion in cases already permitted, and those cases expanded, especially to include rape and incest. And the example she cited is among one of the many horrific ones that I've read about to describe why people were pushing for these kinds of expansions. So she says, and it's quite clinical the way that she describes, but the tragedy carries. And she explained, in one instance, a 17-year-old girl was raped by 6 men. The girl's emotional development was threatened. Severe psychological punishment was forced on the girl. Needless to say, an abortion was performed. In spite of support that the bill received from reputable doctors, and that's one of the other breakpoints is that are these reputable doctors? These were reputable physicians. And many in the state house, many of the representatives supported it. It didn't pass, and it was defeated by 2 votes. Although Doc Brown would continue to advocate for women's reproductive rights, her stance on abortion actually was a part of what ended her political career. After her defeat in 1968, she unsuccessfully attempted to regain a seat in the Tennessee State House 3 times. And in an interview published in Ms. Magazine in 1978, she reflected on these defeats. And she noted, "I've paid the price over and over again. I don't think I'll ever be able to gain political office unless an ultimate disposition of the whole question of abortion is made." So when I began outlining the themes that I thought I was going to cover in this project that was just, and it still is, just an article about Doc Brown and her work in reproductive rights and reproductive health, I thought that I would explore the ways that her personal and professional ties to adoption and abortion were sort of the driving force behind this effort. So a kind of straight women's history, right? That's my training. And so I really was seeing it through those questions. To do this, I thought I still have to read the Tennessee newspapers because I want to know what her constituents and patients and what Doc Brown even may have been reading in the newspapers about Tennessee. So what I set out was this ambitious research plan. I was going to read all of the coverage of abortion in the major Tennessee newspapers from 1950 to 1972. Well, as you can imagine, that project takes a lot of time. And so I'm kind of drawing back on dates. I'm trying to reconfigure and maybe stop just when she loses. But the reason I had set those boundaries up was because I wanted to talk about the period that would cover when Doc Brown was a student in Tennessee, then when she started practicing, to the year before Roe v. Wade. We'll see how that goes. given that there's so much written, I've really only gotten through almost the 1950s. I'm almost through the 50s, and that's again why I'm reconsidering my plan. And many of the stories I found talk about abortion in ways that I expected. There are sensational stories about abortion rings and women being deceived by quacks. There are stories about men who killed abortion providers following the death of a loved one due to a botched abortion. And there are stories of local women and women who cross state lines to obtain services from physicians who provided illegal abortions. The biggest surprise of this part of the research has actually come from this last category of news coverage, because I didn't expect to find so many stories about African American physicians being arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to serve jail time for providing abortions to both African American and white clients. This discovery has led me to reevaluate my first conclusions about Dr. Brown's motivations. She was certainly fighting for women's reproductive rights and health, but I'm beginning to wonder, was she also fighting and pursuing this as a way of increasing racial justice for the physicians? Did Doc Brown know some of these doctors? And was she seeing part of her work as not just seeking justice for them, but justice in a system that was in, unjust because of racism? So now I'm thinking about this project as an exploration of choice, faith, and justice. The doctors, and I think we're going to do a bit of a shift here, but you'll see why. The images on this slide are of a couple of the doctors whose stories made the Tennessee newspapers. Now, there are many more, but I include them, the image on the left, I include because this is Dr. Kori Wilson, described in newspaper articles as a Negro physician. She was 75 years old, as you can see on this image, at the time that she was prosecuted. And I only include her story, I could go into detail, but I won't. But I include her because I love that picture, as the picture included in a newspaper article about an arrested abortion provider. She looks like a grandma, so I have her for that reason. But I'm going to say a little bit more about the image on the right, because this is Dr. Reuben Bartholomew Jackson, or people called him BJ Jackson, or RB Jackson, as you can see, because his case actually made national news. Jackson was charged of involuntary manslaughter as an abortion provider. And the story unfolded because he says, and let's do it this way. He was accused of having provided an abortion for a young white woman, a secretary, who later died. He was also accused of running an illegal abortion mill, and one of the oft repeated accusations was that he either supervised or performed up to 5 abortions a day. He was charged. There was a narcotics charge. People said he had narcotics. They implicated him as someone involved in drug dealing because he was also part owner of a nightclub in Nashville. And this was not the first time that he had actually been brought up on charges for narcotics. And in fact, he had been convicted in 1939. He was committed to federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas on a 5-year, he was supposed to serve 5 years. They actually paroled him in 41. So this second indictment comes up and they bring these charges. And here's a segment of what there are so many news. The story goes on for years and years. So I've been reading about him quite a bit, but several articles describe what was at stake in his arrest. And here's one. Dr. R.B. Jackson, alleged operator of an abortion mill, while free on parole from a similar case, he was charged in another abortion case too, was indicted today on counts of involuntary manslaughter and abortion in the December death of a young Houston County white woman. And these are the important, you can see that's quite significant. The abortion count charges that Jackson, Negro physician, maliciously did use and employ certain instruments upon the woman who came to his office from her home in Erin, said use of instruments not being done with a view to preserving the life of the mother. Thus, he did unlawfully and feloniously destroy such child before its birth. So you can see these are the key issues they have to prove. They have to prove that he wasn't within the legal parameters for this procedure. And there are articles that show all of the instruments that they collected. They like lay them out on tables, and there are just pictures of those. Ebony magazine, though, also included a story about Dr. Jackson, and this is the only story that I found in Ebony dealing with abortion. And as I said, other scholars have also pointed to this article. But they use it as a part of an expose implicating Black physicians who were facing charges for providing illegal adoptions, or highlighting the fact that these physicians were African American. Ebony noted that Jackson claimed that he was innocent and that he had only attempted to assist the young woman who was brought to his office by an unnamed white man. And this is, again, many questions. How did the unnamed white man know how to get to your office? Communities are segregated, so people don't buy what he's selling. The article highlighted the greed and immorality of abortion and the work of these abortion providers as an example of, quote, the viciousness of the abortion menace, which today has become one of the biggest problems confronting the medical profession. The piece went on to claim that illegal abortion mills had, quote, ballooned into a corrupt $10 million a year racket, preying on the ignorance of misguided women who are willing to pay fees ranging from $25 to $1,000 to get rid of an unwanted baby at great danger to their own lives. Okay, we're coming up on time. Dr. Brown was aware of these mills and spoke out against the doctors who profited because of unregulated underground practices. She remembered, and this was a quote from the article that about her in Ms. Magazine. She said, quote, the thing that really stirred me was when I figured out how much an abortionist in the black market made. The lowest figure was $350 per procedure. And any abortionist worth his salt could be doing at least 6 a day. So again, she's making this distinction between what is black market and what should be legally provided. But she was also aware of the reputable doctors who performed abortions to assist vulnerable girls and women who often experienced blame and shame when they became pregnant, even under those horrific circumstances that we've already mentioned, and then sought an abortion. So the last example I want to mention from some of the reading that I've been doing is one that is also in the Abortion Menace article from Ebony. And it kind of lets us in on some of the more insidious societal beliefs about girls and women and their sexuality and the senses that they are culpable in what happens to them. So the article describes some of the really shocking figures, and there's no evidence for how they came to these numbers, but the article claimed that there were about 700,000 abortions performed annually and that 8,000 women die. Now, the researcher and scholar Ricky Solinger, who does a lot of work in reproductive rights, reproductive health, history, notes that, quote, Ebony's Black readership had special reason to pay attention to this warning, since in grossly disproportionate numbers, Black women were among the fatalities. And this is a theme that's carried throughout this history, that African American women were dying at higher rates per their population. After describing the high death rates associated with these black market, what Dr. Brown calls black market abortions, and the lack of consistent prosecutions of such cases, the piece then noted, quote, that, quote, women themselves or their families are frequently unwilling to press charges, either out of fear of reprisal or because of the unsavory publicity involved. And then this is where we get into the example that I think highlights some of the ways that this is that there's a real painful reckoning regarding the way that women are held responsible for some of the crimes committed against them. So here's the example, and this is a rather long quote, but it's rich. I want to make sure we hear it. Quote: "Such was the case only a few months ago in Birmingham, Alabama, when an unusually developed 14-year-old high school girl allowed herself to be seduced by an uncle rather than have him expose her for carrying on a flirtation with one of her teachers. 3 months after the intimacy, she tearfully told her mother what had happened, confessed her pregnancy, and accused the uncle of being the father of her unborn child. The mother, fearful of a scandal, immediately hired a very prominent physician to perform an abortion on her errant daughter. And it was only a matter of a few hours until the girl lay dying. The family, however, because of the delicate circumstances involved, refused to cooperate with authorities, and the doctor has never been brought to trial. So this is a part of that article in Ebony, Abortion Menace. And notice the use of phrases like unusually developed, allowed herself to be seduced, and errant daughter. These phrases suggest ways that some in African American communities, plural, understood appropriate gender behavior and insisted on a type of respectability that held women accountable for certain types of sexual indiscretion and, again, crimes committed against them. The article also shows how some African Americans sticky pages, how some African Americans understood abortion as a moral issue. In one section, the quote that really stands out is, "Abortion is actually killing a life and a crime against decency as well as law." These perspectives actually affirm my sense that Dr. Brown was working for African American physicians and certainly for women, and especially African American women, for whom access to reproductive choice was severely constrained. And this was again about justice. It's actually quite disheartening, as you might imagine, to see how many of these injustices are on the rise in the wake of the Dodd's decision. But I'm also really moved by Dr. Brown's responses to the opposition she faced. And this is just one of the many quotes. She kind of is a quote machine, but one of the many quotes that has stuck with me as I consider these histories, but also sort of the contemporary connections as we face a world in which Dodd has sort of taken us back to a time where access was constrained. As you can see, she said, and this was in response, someone was asking her about, well, do you feel disheartened by the defeats? And she says, no, I haven't accepted defeat, not in my entire life. The only defeat I understand is physical defeat. To me, it's a grievous, grievous sin for people to waste the days of their lives and not do something that makes the world a little better. Oh, yep, oh, the comma's in the wrong place. Or at least notifies the world that you've been around. So when I think about the connection or the idea that we can take abortion and sort of replace it with adoption, I'm actually more convinced by what we see on the screen. This implication of the real reasons that many women seek abortion, that instead of thinking about abortion, adoption, not abortion, that we should really be thinking about things like affordable health care, education, investing in communities and livable wages, that by fighting for these kinds of this access, we're actually showing the world that we've been around. Thank you.
Thank you, Kori, for that wonderful and powerful presentation. There's an opportunity now to have a discussion, ask questions, and I invite you to use the Q&A function on Zoom if you want to post a question. And I can either read it for you, or if you wish, we can unmute, or you can unmute and ask the question directly. So if there's any questions out there, please go ahead and post them in the Q&A, or if you'd like to speak, you can raise your hand and unmute. And I have questions, but I want to let others speak first about this interesting, fascinating research. All right, I'll give people a moment to gather their thoughts. But Kori, I had my question about this research. You got me thinking about kind of intersectionality and this intersectional approach by linking these questions about gender and race when it comes to, as you said at the end, kind of access to a broader range of rights and supports, whether it be reproductive rights or other kinds of support. And so I was curious, and I think you kind of got at this a bit in the end about the respectability dimension of some of the stories, but I was curious to hear you think, it's kind of a two-part question.
Okay.
I was curious to hear you think about class.
Mm-hmm.
How is class a factor, particularly with the profession of being a physician? I thought you were kind of suggesting this was crucial to the story. And then the other kind of intersectional factor I thought about was region. And how much is this a Nashville and Tennessee story, and how much of does it connect to other places and stories? And just a last thought, which is, I mean, intersectionality has always been meant to talk about kind of structural oppression and the forces shaping people's lives. But I also, in another way, got to thinking about your themes of choice, faith, and justice as a kind of intersectional trio in terms of how they relate to each other. But yeah, so class and region, how are these factors in this research?
Class is when the sources themselves require really careful interpretation and analysis, because Ebony, especially the print media, and my first project, the adoption work, I spent a lot of time looking at both newspaper coverage and coverage in the glossy print media, African American magazines. And they were pitching toward a sort of middle class ideal. And so Ebony in particular, which was the leading Black magazine from the 40s into the 80s, was about sort of middle class respectability. And you really, it is that is a thread that is consistent throughout the publication. And John H. Johnson, the publisher, he really felt like that was the way to accomplish a kind of civil rights or rights advance. So there is a class component, but I think what gets lost, and this is a part of what Reagan's work does, she talks about the way that we have set up this idea that, and she sees it comes through in research with Sanger and some of those early contraception advocates, birth control advocates, that there's this notion that the middle class and women of wealth had access to and were using these, whether contraception or abortion, whereas the poor didn't and were sort of outside of that. One theme that comes through, though, is that even if you have the forward presentation and a rhetoric of respectability, and Reagan argues this, what people actually did in their day-to-day experiences sort of cuts across that. So everything that we can get our hands on suggests that there is a call to respectability in African American communities, but there's also the acknowledgement that women in all strata are facing these challenges, whether it's them personally or if they are assisting some woman in their community. One of the things that comes up in the article is the shock among the Ebony reporter that it's more married women who are seeking abortion services. So class is a part of it, but another big part of it, and that feeds into class, is that these are mothers who can't afford the children they have, and abortion is a way to manage when you have not been able to, when your contraception hasn't worked. So there is the sense that this is a story about class, and some of the ways that we've told the history suggest that, yes, there's access and there's sort of a way that the more upper classes can hide the way that they are participating in these different efforts to control when, if, how they have children. And I think that's really more revealing, is that access means that you don't have to reveal in ways that if you are having to seek an abortion in a way that is much more dangerous, your choice becomes much more public because you're engaging with the officials, police sometimes. You're engaging with physicians who are tending to some kind of medical issue as a result of a surgery that was performed poorly. So I think that there is a discussion to have, but it is less about who's seeking and more about how are certain behaviors more public and others sort of contained. And in terms of region, I now wish that I had pulled. So, one of the slides that I was going to use has a map of the current state of abortion access in the country and how that's shifted since Dobbs. And I was going to set it up against a map that looks at sort of right before Roe v. Wade in terms of showing access. Because, yes, when we think about these questions of region, you can sort of see that there is a Mason Dixon quality to it, not exclusively, but that in the South, and yes, the South, more African Americans historically lived in the South. So there is a way that this is a regional story. Part of the question that I have right now and that I'm going to be developing, as I said, for some reason, Tennessee had a number of African American medical schools, and I'm not sure why. And so it feels like this is a really strong Tennessee story because I think there were more trained physicians and that they were providing services. So there's definitely the sense that this is a Tennessee story. I'm curious about how it looks in other places. Nashville is a city that you have an established African American middle and professional class. And so I think that also shapes how this experience is unfolding. But the fact that they had all of these medical schools for a weird amount of time, I think that has something to do with this regional quality. And I was at one point I was trying to think, can we do this story? I was going to sort of, is there a New York, Tennessee story since she's a New York, Tennessee person? But I haven't really been able to develop that.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I think Lauren Kazakowicz, I hope I said your last name correctly, has
Very
a
good.
question. I did it. Lauren, go ahead. Thanks for your patience.
Oh, Kori, I'm gonna I just want to make a couple of observations because one of the women that I study in New York, I was thrilled that Dr. Brown was a politician, spearheaded abortion reform in New York State in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
And she, and you've got me to broaden my thoughts on this, but I argued that to align the religious issues with the Catholic Church in the state, she made a class argument. It was largely, and it was largely aimed at the middle class, the not extremely wealthy and the not extremely poor, and that became her framework that abortion is happening. It's just that wealthy people can get the medically acceptable ones or go somewhere else. And but the religious issue was in New York, but it was Catholic, not fundamentalist. I mean, the Catholic Church went full court press. They were denouncing legislators from the pulpit on Sundays. And also she had to make an argument to moderates in New York who were going to carry the day. But so there is definitely a regional component. The other thing I was wondering if you thought a lot about or much, it seems as though the 60s saw an increased number of women legislators and that they carried the torch for this, and in a good way, in a sense that not everybody agreed with them, but they got respectable hearing because they were women and the issue was closer to them. So you had Dr. Brown, she's a female, she's a doctor, the whole 9 yards. So did you think about the role of women's emergence as a political force at the same time that they start to advocate for this particular issue?
I think that's a question to pursue. Doc Brown, I don't know enough about the makeup of these different state legislatures to have a sense of what did that transition look like. I'm much more familiar with the later sort of post 92 explosion of women as representatives. So it's definitely a question to walk backward and see what were those numbers, because it sounds like the example that you mentioned, and I'm sure there are others that probably confirm that yes, women because again, I was thinking about this as a women's issue and women's history. It makes sense that female politicians would use use the platform to sort of chip away at these barriers to provide women more access. So I don't know, but it is definitely something that depending on where I go with it, as I said, I get lost in newspaper research and I'm just
Oh,
seeing
so
new
many places,
newspapers. And
so many places.
so if I can sort of get myself pulled out of my newspaper rut to explore some of the legislative what was happening legislatively across the nation, or at least in a comparative way,
Yeah.
could yield a lot. Because sounds like that. Yeah, it sounds like that could be what's happening, a part of what's happening. Thank you, Lauren. And I noticed that Robin has a question in the chat. What happened to her adopted daughter? Did she carry on her mother's work? Her adopted daughter is still alive, and it's been uh, something that I've thought a lot about. Sort of, do I approach her? When do I approach her? She is not. She didn't carry on her mother's work, but she is. People, and I'm concerned because when I was at Fisk and I asked the question, there was a sense that people have tried to work with her and she has not been as forthcoming. So I'm still trying to decide how to approach her. She's very proud of her mother's legacy and she's very proud of the work that she did, especially in the more toward the African American recognition of African American history and experience. But I got the sense that the abortion piece is not as, she doesn't talk about it as much. So
Thank you for
thank
that.
you, Robin.
Christina Boylan has a question, and Christina,
Mm-hmm.
if you'd like, why don't you unmute and ask your question and can elaborate from there?
Yeah, sure. This is such a pleasure to see you, Kori, and we're gonna connect.
Yes.
But this is absolutely fascinating. And again, just disturbed at how much rhetoric is coming around in a new iteration these days. I'm curious if in the articles in Ebony and other publications, if you sense, and this gets weird in like so many ways in so many directions, and
Mm-hmm.
different communities articulate, fears of different kinds of racial suicide. If we
Mm-hmm.
allow abortion to be legal, one
Mm-hmm.
population will diminish or
Right.
another. And
Right.
I wonder if you found that in general or in particular elaborated for African American communities, like as part of this discussion.
So there was a definite stance against certain forms of contraception, birth control, abortion, historically in Black communities. And this goes back to Michael's question about class. Part of the challenge is to figure out, are these claims being made coming from the more elite, or are they truly representative of multiple parts of these communities? So the example that people reference most is the example of African Americans who did say that contraception and birth control were a form of race suicide and discouraged women from taking it. And it was coming from male. One example that does come up is men involved with Nation of Islam, of course, were like, no way. And then other men in elite academic circles were saying that that there is a race suicide component. What I'm tickled by is there's a series that came out. Gosh, I can't even remember how long it's been. Anyone who knows, just shout it out. But it was the history series, the Makers documentary series, and it was just doing that work of trying to describe and sort of celebrate a particular progressive and advance narrative of women in history and society in the United States. And a number of the African American female activists who participated in that talk to that challenge. And they say, yes, there were calls to not participate, to not abort, to not use contraception because of fears of race suicide. Part of it is tied, of course, to the history of things like sterilization and the ways that especially in place, again, going back to North Carolina, the North Carolina's horrible history of sterilization of African American women, but the history of sterilization, that all of these efforts and sort of the longer history of African American women's bodies being used for research, when we think about even the development of the profession of obstetrics. We know that the father of obstetrics was practicing on enslaved women. So that history factors into the response and the skepticism. But what these activists say in the documentary, and they say it with a chuckle, is that yes, there were these calls coming, and especially from men, but that women were using contraception and women were getting abortions. So it is a part of the history, and the challenge is to figure out which aspects of sort of Black identity are making these calls for a commitment to racial solidarity that would look this way versus a recognition of how women's experiences of pregnancy, of childbirth, are informing their decisions to choose contraception and to choose abortion. So it does come up, and I'm, as I said, I'm thinking of so many ways that I would love to take the project, but also some of the real difficulties of accessing these different kinds of stories. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Christina. Kendra Smith-Howard has a question, and Kendra, no worries about it being a little late. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Kori.
Hi, Kendra.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, and I missed a little bit of the bio of some of the physicians you're talking about, but can you say more about where they were educated and if any of them were attended historically Black medical schools like Howard or Meharry Medical College or those places? And a little bit about the extent to which the curriculum at those institutions, did they embrace the opportunity to educate graduates in obstetrics and reproductive health, or were they concerned about the scrutiny that doing so might attract? And just a little bit more about the kind of curriculum at those institutions, and you may or may not know in depth yet, but it seems like comparing it to other medical schools might be interesting. Just wondering any sort of respectability, politics, and education questions.
So the physicians, yes, a number of them attended, and this ties into the regional piece too. In the South, they were only going to Black medical colleges. So she completed her degree at Meharry. The others, I would need to sit down and actually sort of put the list together. But yes, these are graduates of Black medical colleges. As I mentioned, Tennessee had more than Meharry for a while, and African Americans were training in these African American, historically, what today we call historically Black colleges and universities. I don't know about the curriculum piece yet, and it is something that I am going to explore. It was, there are always these research moments where it's like, I should have been paying attention. When I was doing the project on adoption, I was looking at the social welfare curriculum, social work curriculum for Black colleges and universities. And I thought, man, that would have been the moment to sort of dive into some of this other stuff. But I didn't even know I was going in this direction. So I don't know. But when I was doing the adoption work, there was definitely an indication that the curriculum was designed to affirm these aspects of respectability that we've highlighted, scholars have highlighted, that were dominant among the Black middle class, and that created a real tension between Black middle class professionals and the clientele of working class and poor individuals that they were trying to coordinate services for. So it's a part of the question that I would like to answer. And my challenge now is to decide which schools and what kind of comparison to set up. But that is a part of the list, Kendra. Thank you.
Oh, I look forward to hearing the outcome of that work. Thanks.
Thank you, Kendra. Sheila Karen Bernard has a question. Please unmute and go ahead. Thanks.
Hey, Kori, it's so fascinating and it's so timely, and I so wish your book was on the market today. I mean, it's just, so I have sort of an ancillary question about it because it so deeply informs so much of the conversation that we're having in this country, horrifyingly enough. And I'm wondering if you're finding that access to this research is changing because of the current climate. Are you finding that it's harder to get information, or that people are not as forthcoming, or that there's some kind of movement to sort of shut down this inquiry because people don't want this history to inform the present?
Right. So yeah, and is this a part of the way that people are? No, I haven't. But most of my resources, I'm just using a lot of print media and the historic archives. So there, I have not encountered, but I will say this, and people, if you've heard me talk about the adoption project before, you might have heard this story. I started because and many of my projects emerge out of this curiosity, what was going on. And that's how I ended up with the adoption focus. And at the time, I had no idea how controversial adoption is, and especially with now, and I'm a part of the critical adoption studies efforts to really draw attention to the ways that adoption can be injurious too, and that it's not the silver bullet to the problems of families that are experiencing challenges. So when I started that project, I didn't think about that because I was just like, what were these families doing and who were these families? And that's really neat, isn't it? And then I started talking with and listening, more than talking, listening to adult adoptees who are scholars, and their critiques became central to the way that I started to think about and analyze this history of adoption, which was once a celebrated history, a history that was about, people believed was about benevolence and about rescue and family formation, to become more sensitive to the ways that it was also a violent history and a history about disruption and child stealing. And at the time when I finished the project, I was happy. I'm happy that it's out, and I'm happy that it offers, especially for adult adoptees, answers to questions and maybe even support for some of their efforts to shift policies around adoption, especially transnational adoption. But when I finished, Sheila, I said, I am never doing a controversial project again. I did. I was like, never again. And then I was like, Doc Brown's story has to be told. And so now I'm just in it. So I anticipate that there will definitely be, if not constraints on access to evidence and sort of resources, but a definite pushback on this proposal that I'm making, that the loudness of the anti-abortion community around, especially, and you could see on those signs that it's about, the loving way, abortion, not that this is that by setting up this notion that faith and choice cannot inhabit the same space, we've lost the history, a really rich history of people who are probably like Dr. Brown, and I wonder in ways that when we started to look at our political maps and sort of see them as more purple than just red or blue, I wonder about if we actually start to tell these stories, how it will shift the way that we think about sort of majorities on this topic. Because what comes through in the research that's already been done is that Protestant churches and even certain members of the Catholic Church were supportive and actually helped in these underground abortion efforts. And so I think that part of the story, you're right, I don't think people who are opposed want that told. So I can certainly imagine it, and I'm just going to Pollyanna my way through it until it happens, because that's the way I get things done. It's like, this isn't controversial at all, right? And then it becomes clear that there is.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, which opened up all kinds of interesting other parts of the story and the challenge of doing this kind of historical research with the fraught politics. That reminded me of another question I had, which got me thinking about the Roe decision, and which was grounded, of course, in this idea of the right to privacy. I wondered if the research you've been doing on Dr. Brown and on this story has put some pressure on the logic of the Roe decision in the post-Dobbs world. In other words, the question of privacy as it relates to choice and justice and faith. Do you think is there something about that kind of the history of privacy in the US and in other ways, particularly your last slides, which point us more towards public policy and away from privacy? Do you feel like this research is shifting some of your thinking about that?
It's shifting my thinking, and it's also affirming what we're seeing in some places that I remember, again, when Dobbs happened, it pushed, we also then took a trip, we were visiting friends in Canada, and we were in Ottawa at the Capitol, and our Canadian friends, which I love to say all the time, my Canadian friends were talking about the ways that what happened in the US forced Canadians to work to create a clear protection for abortion, because they had also just relied on the fact that there was openings like the yes. And so what I'm thinking about is the way that now certain states are affirming the right to abortion specifically, and not sort of that more nebulous, the right to privacy and a woman and her doctor get to choose. And so it does put pressure, and I think that's one of the reasons that Dr. Brown was pushing for a law that would actually codify abortion, not privacy. And it really is one of the arguments against Roe, is that there is no, if we are thinking about the unnamed rights that the Constitution supposedly protects, a lot of things end up in danger. So it has forced me to think about sort of strategy. Is a state by state strategy that actually insists that the practice itself is protected? Is that a way to move forward? And we're seeing that it's clearly not, because the states they were ready. They had their laws on the books, and as soon as Dobbs happened, they activated those laws. The other thing, though, that I'm curious about in terms of the policy piece is the history, and it really is a short history. If you think about it, Connecticut passed the first law in 1921, and again, Reagan's book is important because she says, I'm looking at the full span of these laws. And one of the things that she highlights is that these laws were often about sort of the methods, and so less about prosecuting individuals and more about dealing with methods. So the first ones were about poisons. Are you ingesting? We're going to outlaw that. And it's made me think about the way that the laws themselves matter, but we're in a moment where it's really about enforcement. And so how far are we going to go with the enforcement, and in the ways that states are actually going after the individual? And I think that is going to push more to force the necessity of enshrining in public policy protections and rights for women that have been denied them. Again, what's tragic to me is when you look at these stories, and honestly, horrific. When I was writing, I kept going, horrific. And I was like, you got to come up with a better word. But it truly is horrific. The crimes that have been allowed against women, and the ways that but a failure to address in law and in policy these crimes against women leads to not only this moment where we see this particular kind of access, but it draws us back to questions about women and the birthing experience. How is it that in the United States, African American women are dying giving birth? So it does. There's a place where you see it as there's policy, there's enforcement. And I do think that it is about a more public, yes, a more public facing challenge, because privacy was kind of it was the way to do it. It was how they could get it done. But by not then going and making sure that state by state, the actual practice was protected, we find ourselves in this moment. And as I said, my Canadian friends were like, when they saw it happen, they were like, oh, shoot, we need to firm this up in our law, because the challenge, the potential for challenge is there. It's there.
Well, thank you, Kori, for this, for venturing again into a controversial topic, for bringing Dr. Brown's story and life for keeping it around, as she said, which is also crucial, and for helping us think about all the difficult parts of this story and also the parts of it to celebrate. Let's see, there's one last comment that came in from Ann McPherson. The ERA will be on the ballot in New York State in November. It would encode abortion rights in the state constitutions.
Yes.
A New York State story.
Right. Well, and I will just jump in right here and say one more thing, and then we will call the question. The other thing that's kind of staggering is the way that the effort to obtain abortion is now driving women and families to these extreme measures, and that it is so important that states like New York do that, because families are having to leave their state and make arrangements, and it's putting pressure on these states and the communities that do provide these services. I think the other loss is that when we allow the one issue to become the dominant part of the story, we miss that this is a women's health issue more broadly, and that by legislating against the right to access abortion services, it's creating a health crisis. In states where these laws are being passed, obstetrics are declining, and people are actually leaving states, so that places, Idaho is an example that I was looking at recently, that they don't have the obstetric coverage that they need. And so it puts at risk women's health across the board. And that's one of the parts of the story that we don't hear enough about. It's about abortion, and the 1960s turn to really focus on this idea of the life of the child being the measure of these decisions. And so and it's the success of that effort, really, that they could stay one issue and drive that home. But in doing that, it negates the fact that this is a more connected and diverse health crisis. And it is leaving girls and women vulnerable across the country by eliminating access and then putting pressure on services in states where services are available. So I felt like that's the other driving theme in my head right now. But thank you.
A more comprehensive kind of sense of the issue, which the history of Dr. Brown brings, I think, to the surface in this way, because of the range of her thinking and her career and her work.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for attending during kind of a quieter time in the semester. We really appreciate your presence here, and again, thanks to Dr. Graves. Just to close, if you're interested in continuing to participate in the SUNY Historians Network webinar series, or you'd like to join the mailing list, you can contact me at mkramer@brockport.edu. The link is in the chat section. And we'll be continuing this fall and into next academic year. So please feel free to join us. If you're interested in presenting or have ideas for webinars, you can also send me an email about that. So I hope everyone has a wonderful summer. Thanks again to Dr. Graves. Thanks to all of you for being here, and we'll see you in the fall.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you again. Bye.